Hello, so today I would like us to talk about homeostasis. So in homeostasis we are going to give out the definition of the term. The other thing, we discuss the key principles, we discuss the feedback mechanisms, that is the positive and the negative feedback mechanisms. We will also talk about physiological examples of positive and negative feedback mechanisms, and lastly conclusion. So let us start with the definition of the term homeostasis. The concept of homeostasis was first proposed by this Frenchman called Claude Bernard in the 19th century and was further developed canon in the early 20th century. So what is this concept, or what does that concept of homeostasis mean? We say homeostasis is a fundamental biological concept that refers to the body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment despite external changes. So you see, in the environment that we live, we have a lot of changes, but our bodies are able to maintain a stable internal environment despite those changes. That is what we refer to as homeostasis. This stability is crucial for the proper functioning of cells, tissues and organs within an organism, because our bodies are made of cells, tissues and organs, and also organ systems which make up an organism. Homeostasis involves the regulation of various physiological variables. So different variables within the body are regulated through homeostasis, and they include the temperature, the blood sugar levels, the electrolyte balance, among others. For example, here we have a diagrammatic representation of homeostasis. Number one, here we have a variable or homeostasis, and the change is detected by a receptor. Number two, we have the receptor which detects the change, and after detecting the change, the information is sent to the control center. Number three, information sent along different pathway to the control center. Now the control center brings about the change or the output. Now the information is sent along the efferent pathway to the effector. Yes, and now the effector brings about the response to effector feeds back to influence magnitude of stimulus and returns variable to homeostasis. That is number 5, bringing about what we call balance or very little change. Yes, let's talk about the key principles of homeostasis. Number one, we have the set point. And the set point, we say homeostasis typically involves maintaining a specific set point or reference value for a particular physiological variable. For example, our body's temperature, we know it is 37, but within our environment, it changes, either it decreases or it increases. So through homeostasis, our body temperature is able to be maintained at around that 7 degrees Celsius despite those changes in the environment, because that 7 degrees Celsius is the set point, that reference value or set point. The other term is feedback mechanism, where we say to maintain the set point or the reference value, the body uses feedback mechanisms, which involves sensors or the receptors which detect the change in the body. Now we have the control centers, which can be either the brain or different glands, and the effectors, they carry out the response. We have two types of feedback mechanisms. Number one, negative feedback, and the number two, we have positive feedback. What is negative feedback? In this type of feedback, or in this type of mechanism within the body, the negative feedback, the body responds to deviations from the set point by initiating process that counteracts the change. We are saying that in case of a change, the body will respond, and the response will be to do what? To counteract the change, to bring the body to normal. For example, if the body temperature increases above the set point. So in humans, the set point we've said is that 7 degrees Celsius. If it increases above that 7 degrees Celsius, the sweat glands are activated to cool the body. They cool the body by producing sweat, and when the sweat evaporates, it carries away heat from the body, hence cooling the body. That is a negative feedback, an example of a negative feedback, which is trying to bring about internal environment which is stable despite the changes in the external environment, because when the temperature rises, you'll have to sweat, and the sweat will call away heat to maintain the set point. Number 2, we have positive feedback, and we say this type of feedback amplifies the initial change rather than opposing it. So instead of bringing the body to balance, it will just amplify or increase the kind of change that is taking place. It is less common in homeostasis, and it is involved in certain processes like blood clotting and childbirth. We say, for example, in blood clotting, number 1, the body responds by producing platelets. Now, after production of platelets, which initiate blood clotting, other chemicals are produced, and when those chemicals are produced, they lead to production of more and more platelets. That is an example of a positive feedback, which will amplify the initial change. It does not oppose the change. The other example is about childbirth. So let us talk about the physiological examples. And we start with negative feedback mechanisms. Let's start with the body temperature. We say when your body temperature rises above the normal set point, that is above that 7 degrees Celsius, negative feedback mechanisms are activated to bring it back to normal. For example, when you exercise and your body temperature increases, sweat glands release sweat. As sweat evaporates from your skin, it cools your body, helping to lower the temperature. That is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. Once your temperature returns to the set point, the sweating stops, preventing overheating. Yes, so we've said first, the temperature rises in the body. That is a change. Now the receptor cells in the body, they will detect the change, and they will stimulate the control center, which will initiate what? Sweating, so as to bring the temperature back to normal. Here we have the example. Body temperature increases at this point, followed by what? Body temperature increases followed by cooling process, which is activated, that is sweating. And the sweat brings the body temperature down. Now when the body temperature decreases, heating process is activated, and it is achieved through shivering, so as to bring the body temperature to normal. That is an example. This is it again. We have the body temperature rising, and when it rises, body sweats. When the body sweats, temperature drops, and when it drops below normal, our bodies shiver so as to produce it, and the temperature will rise again. The other one, or the other example of negative feedback mechanism, is blood glucose regulation. And we say after you eat a meal, your blood glucose or sugar levels rise. In response, your pancreas releases an hormone called insulin, and the insulin allows cells to take up glucose for energy, and the extra glucose is converted for storage in the liver. As a result, blood glucose levels decrease. When blood glucose levels drops too low, the pancreas releases another hormone called glucagon, which stimulates the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream, raising blood sugar levels. This is another example of negative feedback mechanism, and its main purpose is to ensure blood glucose levels are maintained within a narrow range. So we've said when the glucose levels goes up, insulin is produced, which converts glucose into what? Into energy, and the extra glucose is stored. And when the levels go too low, another hormone called glucagon is produced, which stimulates the liver to release glucose so as to maintain glucose at a what? At the optimum levels. That is the other example of negative feedback mechanism. Here you can look at this diagram, the blood sugar. When the blood sugar levels are too low, pancreas releases glucagon. Liver breaks down stored glucogen and releases glucose into blood. And when the blood glucose levels are too high, pancreas releases insulin, and the insulin removes glucose from the blood and stores it as glycogen. That is also the same diagram where we talk about homeostasis. Blood glucose increases and it is stored in the liver. When it decreases, the liver converts glucogen to glucose to bring glucose levels back to normal. Let's talk about positive feedback mechanisms, and the first example is childbirth. We say when a woman goes into labor, uterine contractions start. The contractions push the baby's head against the cervix, causing the cervix to stretch. This stretching of the cervix sends signals to the brain to release oxytocin hormone, a hormone that stimulates stronger uterine contractions. Now look at this. During labor, the wall of the uterus contracts. Then an hormone is produced, oxytocin, which causes further contraction. It does not bring about change in the initial process, but it amplifies the process. It leads to stronger uterine contraction, and we say this positive feedback loop continues until the baby is born, and that is an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Look at this diagram. We say baby growth takes up all space in the uterus, and the stretch receptors are activated in the uterus to cause the contractions. Now the brain signals for release of another hormone called oxytocin, and the oxytocin causes further contraction until the baby is born. That is a positive feedback mechanism. Let's talk about the other example, that is blood clotting, and it takes place in case of a cut or an injury. And we say a positive feedback mechanism is involved in blood clotting. When platelets in the body encounter the injured area, they release chemicals that attract more platelets to the site. As more platelets accumulate, they release even more clotting factors, leading to the formation of blood clot. First, you see there is production of platelets, and the platelets initiate blood clotting. Chemicals are also released which initiate production of more platelets until a blood clot is formed. That is another example of a positive feedback mechanism. This is the diagram here. You can see number 1, we have break or tear occurs in blood vessel. Number 2, platelets adhere to the site and release chemicals. Number 3, release chemicals attract more platelets. And number 4, platelets plug is formed. Here we have wounded tissue releases chemicals. Number 2, the chemicals signal platelet activation. Number 3, platelets release chemicals, and the function of those chemicals is to signal platelet activation until a clot is formed. We say in both types of feedback mechanism, that is negative feedback mechanism and positive feedback mechanism, the goal is to maintain the body's internal environment within a narrow range, that is homeostasis. Negative feedback, we said it counteracts deviations from the set point, but positive feedback amplifies and reinforces a particular physiological response until a particular goal is achieved. But even though they work in that manner, they both try to maintain body's internal environment within a specific range. So this is the summary of all that we've talked about. You can see the receptor here, receiving information or changing the surrounding. It sends the information to the control center here, yes, and the control center now produces an effect or an effector which brings about the response to bring our bodies back to normal. So learners, that is the end of our lesson. Let us meet the next lesson.